to, or if you're here as a single, that's fine, you can be the spokesperson, to tell me what group you're from or department and what issues you would most like to see discussed here this afternoon. I'm going to make a list, and we're going to aim the workshop at your questions and issues. The general topic this afternoon is departmental and gen ed assessment. Particularly my shtick is how to base that assessment on classroom assessment. But any questions having to do with departmental and gen ed assessment are fair game here. So, who wants to start? What department?
Psychology.
Okay. Issues.
I haven't gotten that far in my thinking.
Anybody else from psych there want to help? How far are you? Where are you as a department in assessment?
Well, we have a number of pieces of things that contribute to our assessment plan. One thing that we've done, for example, is using an external assessment instrument. We're in the process of revising for a second round an internal instrument, one that we build ourselves, that is essentially that we might view as a pre-test, post-test kind of thing after people are already through the program. We also collect an essay from our first-year students, and we will be collecting the second round of essays from our fourth-year students this year, so that we're kind of doing a developmental study, and that's the topic is the same topic.
Okay. Can everybody hear this? Everybody hear?
I'm wondering if there are other artifacts that we can collect along the way that will be useful for us.
Okay. Okay. Another group.
This is kind of a irritating question, but I know it's one that's on the minds of many of my colleagues, and that is, why is it the traditional techniques of assessment of student learning, namely exams, are not usually considered assessments of student learning? And especially when, for example, one of the prime things that graduate schools use to assess student learning is the record exam.
As you know, that's a large part of my whole pitch all around the country, is that when assessment agencies say you can't use grading, it's true that grades as unexplained, isolated artifacts with no idea what criteria they were based on are not especially useful for assessment, especially if they remain locked in the classroom so that the rest of the department doesn't know what's going on. But my whole shtick here is that, in fact, the grading process, when it's well done in the classroom, is a wonderfully rich assessment process, and it needs to be the basis of departmental and gen ed assessment. And that will be the whole pitch this afternoon. Okay. Another group.
English, and one difficulty we have because there are a wide number of legitimate approaches to teaching composition.
Mm-hmm.
You get into the whole intellectual freedom thing, sort of. Together. And I realize criteria for assessment might bridge different approaches, but sometimes people are actually looking at different things.
Mm-hmm. So teaching differences and, in a sense, outcome differences. We don't all want the same thing out of our students. Is that good enough? Okay. There's another group. Another group. Good. How many of your departments have hired an extra faculty member because of the drain on your time because of assessment? How many of you have received a 10% addition to your departmental budget to help handle the cost of assessment? No? Nobody? Really? Hey, join the club. We will be talking a lot about simple and effective, especially about simple.
In biology,
level of activity that needs to be undertaken to arrive at an adequate assessment.
Mm-hmm. Good.
Incorporating non-classroom assessment such as required volunteer work or internship.
A stands for assessment here all afternoon, okay? Non-classroom assessment, internships, etc. And what department? Okay. Anybody else I haven't heard from? Okay.
Well, we're in the process of implementing student portfolios. We haven't.
Who's we? English?
Women's studies.
Women's studies, okay.
Maybe getting the most out of those portfolios.
Mm-hmm.
That's certainly effective, I guess.
Yeah. Kind of sums it up, doesn't it? Okay. Others? Mm-hmm. Uh-huh.
Group of
Mhm.
things that are kind of hard to figure out.
Right. Okay.
Taking, creativity and taking the initiative to do things on their own, being a lifelong learner.
Okay. All right, good. It looks to me as though we've got a couple of different strands here. There's the simple and effective strand. How can we get this done with available resources? It's got to be done with available resources, or it won't be done. So that's a crucial question, it seems to me. Then there are questions having to do with how do we do it? What data do we collect? How do we analyze it? And sort of linked to that is, how do we interpret portfolio data? How do we even measure professional behaviors, internships, non-classroom assessments? And then there's something else here, it seems to me. How do we handle all the differences that we want to retain? This is not an exercise, to me, in homogenizing higher education, although that is perhaps the chief danger, I believe, of the assessment movement, and there are many dangers. But one of the chief, certainly, is that it will be a reductionist and homogenizing effect on higher education, helping to rid higher education of some of the wonderful diversity, which is one of the chief, to me, one of the chief glories and defenses of a free society, is that universities are allowed to have a fairly wide diversity in terms of almost everything. Ideologies, ways of teaching, learning outcomes, all kinds of things. And then there's the business of how do we link classroom assessment, exams, assignments, the other kinds of assessment of student learning that we do, with these, quote, assessment plans. So I kind of see 4 threads here. Sound okay? Anybody? Okay. Let's concentrate then this afternoon on those. And let's start with the simple and effective, at least to build the basis here. And let's start by asking what it is that the accreditors want from us. What does a good accreditation plan have according to the NCA? You tell me. Let's review. What do they want?
Measurable results.
Yes. Measurable results. Specifically, they want measurement of outcomes. And they make outcomes meaning student outcomes. So they want you to measure student learning. That's important. It's simple and basic. It sounds easy to say it, but it's very important to remember. They want you to measure student learning. The basic question they want you to ask is, we're doing all this stuff in our department. Is anybody learning anything? Now, it seems to me that that is fundamentally a question that is natural to every teacher. We always ask it. Is anybody learning anything because of what I'm doing here? And if we can incorporate that question and make it our own, keep control of the ways in which it gets answered, then I think it is a very teacherly question. Now, they make a distinction between direct and indirect methods of measuring student learning. Let's talk about that for a minute. What's a direct measure of student learning? Exams, oddly enough. Almost all classroom assignments are considered to be direct. So classroom exams and assignments usually fall under what they define as a direct measure of student learning. What is an indirect measure of student learning? Name an example. Yes, a survey, an alumni survey. A survey of almost anything is, in fact, an indirect measure of learning. Now, if you were to take alums and do a direct measure of learning, how would you have to do it? You would have to actually go into the workplace and test what they knew. It would not be a direct measure if you merely asked their employees how well they were doing, or even if you merely looked at how many of them got jobs or got promoted after 10 years. Those are all considered by the NCA to be indirect measures of learning. The NCA wants you to use multiple measures, but they have a preference for which one of these two? Direct. They have a preference for direct measures, and they don't like to see a plan that relies only on indirect measures. So we will focus today on a mix, but particularly on direct measures, what they call direct measures of student learning. I think that that distinction, and they probably think this too, breaks down, that is, it's not a meat cleaver distinction. There are some methods of data collection and analysis that you wonder, is this direct or indirect? And the distinction doesn't quite work all the way, but they have a purpose in making it. The purpose for their making that distinction is that they want us to focus on student learning. It's important to remember that the assessment movement, friends, is a reform movement. That is crucial to remember. It has a reform agenda. The people who have pushed assessment in this country are trying to make teachers and schools more accountable for what their students can do. And a lot of it is based on what students are and are not able to do in job performance. That is what's driving the assessment movement. And I think we have to understand the spirit, therefore, from which it's coming. All right. So one thing that the NCA wants from us is outcomes measures. And they want particularly direct measurement of student learning. What else do they want? Or question? Another measure of indirect would be what students thought they learned. Another measure of indirect, another way of indirect measurement would be classroom enrollment. Students voting with their feet. Those are all measures that allow you to infer some things about student learning, but they are not considered by the NCA to be direct measures of student learning. Okay? All right. What else does the NCA want?
They want assessment results to guide program change.
Yes. They want results, to guide program change. And that's where you got hit. That's where you got hit. When you were reviewed by the NCA, Bill, do you want to make sure this is accurate? Why don't you say it? Say what you said this morning.
I think
That's where you fell short. By the way, you are not alone. There's a very useful paper that was published, that was written rather by the NCA and makes the rounds in a little informal publication that they have, where they actually went through, this was a kind of a neat thing for them to do to help the folks out in the field. They actually went through all the letters of response that they had written to schools about their assessment plans, and they categorized the different kinds of fault they were finding, so that we now know the most common complaints that NCA has about people's assessment plans. And one of the very, very most common was this one, the feedback loop, using the results to guide program change. So you're not alone, but you are there, and it is for that purpose that the NCA is reviewing you again. They do have some teeth here. I mean, they can schedule you for a second round of review if you don't make it up to snuff on the first round. Okay? What else do they?
So in the absence of any indication of what deficiencies exist in the outcome, if there is no change, then de facto you have an ineffective program?
Did everybody hear that question? Want to say it again?
In the absence of any objective idea of where the deficiencies are, if you go through this process and you don't integrate some kind of a change process, is it by way of saying we have an ineffective program?
I think that there is a little bit that tendency. Because they are a change agenda-driven operation, they tend, I think, to reify change. However, what they want, the good news, I think, is that what they want is for you to have a system by which results of your assessment are consistently fed back into the department. So it may be that what you need to do really is to say annually, such and such a committee reviews the portfolios from our senior seminar and asks these questions and makes a report to the department. Right? Then they are going to ask you, well, have any of these reports ever resulted in any change? They will ask you that. But they are also interested in the mechanism for feedback that you establish, which will be ongoing.
So does that require you to have some criteria when you feel change should be made?
Yes.
You have to state that up front.
Mm-hmm. Yes. Okay. What else does the NCA want to see? Can your department head do this plan all by him or herself? No. They want to see faculty. That was a department head who said that, I assume. They want to see faculty buy-in. Collaborative planning, participation. Not necessarily from every single soul, but it has to be, it has to clearly to them be a collaborative project, not a project that one or two people did all on their own hook. What else?
We're interested in student involvement.
Yes. How about resources? Can you have assessment results over here and then spending your resources over here? No. They want to see that resources follow assessment. That is, that when you find out things about your program and you make some decisions about change, that resources follow those decisions. Okay, so resources. Now, when you set goals for what students ought to be able to do at the end of your program or at the end of your major, do they want to know how those goals are related to institutional mission? Absolutely. They want to see a kind of consistency among institutional mission, college mission. Are you divided into colleges or into divisions or something like that? institutional mission, college mission, and departmental mission. So there has to be consistent mission. Which guides the whole process. Okay? Did I leave out anything?
Maybe one thing, Marty, that's the notion that the first time that you do assessment isn't the last time. It's ongoing.
Yes. Assessment is ongoing. All right. This is what they're asking. They do have some power to make us do this. The question for us, therefore, is not do we do it or not, because we must do it. The question for us is how can we retain in this process what is most valuable to us? How can we make it serve our own ends? How can we turn it to our good? It's being imposed on us, but how can we turn it to our good? And how can we make sure that we don't lose something precious in the interim? And it seems to me that we do that by trying to keep faculty goals for learning and faculty measurement of outcomes and faculty decisions about program change in our own hands. Because if we don't do that, it's going to be forced on us. Somebody else will establish that if we don't. So my pitch is we have to embrace this and make it our own and keep control of it and do it well and explain it well to those external audiences. We've been doing assessment of student learning all along in the grading process. We've been doing it. And if you turn in the salmon handout, this will be just a little bit of a review for those of you who have been in the workshop either this morning or in September. You'll remember this sheet then on page 47. Page 47 in the student handout. '47 and 48 are 9 guidelines from the American Association for Higher Education of what is good assessment practice. Now, let's take these things, which the NCA specifically requires, and these guidelines the AAHE put up. And with those two things in front of you, I'm going to tell you a quick, short story. And again, this will be a repeat for those of you who've been in the workshop this morning. But it's short. Once upon a time, there was a biology faculty member who was teaching a senior capstone biology course. She and the department decided that the most important thing that could happen in this course is that students would learn to use the scientific method for original scientific research. They wouldn't just fill in lab manuals, they'd actually do the whole thing from scratch and really learn how to be scientists. And they would report their findings both orally and in writing to the scientific community. That was the most important thing that could happen in this senior capstone course. The teacher and the department decided. Now the teacher who taught this course had to decide what would be the major tests and assignments in that course. And she decided that, given that goal, there was one perfectly obvious thing to have students to do, and that is a semester-long project in which they conducted their own original scientific research, constructing the hypothesis, designing the experiment, carrying it out, writing it up in scientific report format, and then making a presentation, an oral presentation, to their scientific peers in the classroom. So that was the major assignment for the course. Now, she spent the semester teaching students how to do those things, building on what they learned before, but enhancing what they didn't. So she had lots of other little assessments and exercises and activities and readings and experiments and all kinds of things, and they got lots of feedback. At the very end, when they handed in their written scientific reports, she took a look at this material, gave the students one last round of feedback, finally, how'd you do? And then she looked at them for her own purposes. And she said to herself, you know, they did better this semester on experimental design. I guess these new methods that I did this time worked pretty well, but dang it, they're still not graphing data appropriately. What can I do about this? Can't get good graphs out of these people. So she begins to make plans for her own teaching to try to handle this. And she may also go back to the department and say, look, folks, I'm getting students in this senior seminar who still don't know how to graph data. We got to do something about this. And I don't think that we should have seniors who still haven't done this. Somebody else needs to do this earlier on. And so the department gets together and decides, well, you know, where are we teaching graphing of data? Maybe we need to do more with that in 201. Or maybe we can get the math department to do it. Or maybe we can something else. And so they decide to make a curricular change. End of my story. Is that assessment? You bet it is. That is rich assessment that meets many of the criteria that the AAHE guidelines lay down in the handout, and that can be used for meeting these goals as well. So when an assessment agency, when the NCA says to you that you can't use grades for assessment, they're right in a way. But don't throw out the grading process. Don't throw out the classroom assessment don't throw out the baby with the bathwater here. Because that classroom assessment can be used for departmental assessment. And in fact, if you don't have good classroom assessment, it's hard to imagine how you can have good departmental assessment. So I'd like to show you what this teacher did. And again, we looked at this very briefly in the earlier workshops. What this teacher did was to establish some criteria for these student-written assignments. Page 27. Page 27. The word I use here is primary trait scoring. That's what it's called in the literature. It's a terrible name. It won't mean anything to you. Don't worry about it. What it is a very specific way of announcing your own criteria for student work as a teacher. That's the beauty of this system. It captures the teacher's or the department's criteria. So this teacher decided that she wanted to assess the traits or the things that are marked in bold here. Title, you see on page 27, title, introduction, next page, scientific format, methods and materials, non-experimental information, how that was handled, experimental design, operational definitions, control of variables, and so on. Those are the things that count, both in grading and in assessment. I'm going to explain in a minute how one becomes the other, right? Now, under each of these traits that will count, she constructs a scale. You remember this because we went through it both in September and also this morning. She constructs a scale for each trait. And you remember that we looked at the scale for title specifically, and we looked at some titles that her students had written. Okay. Anybody need more explanation of the basic idea what primary trait scoring is? Got it? All right. What this teacher has now done is to use her own criteria to evaluate student work in her own class on an assignment that she chose. But she has made them explicit in writing. she has made her criteria and standards explicit in writing. Because she has done that, it can now be shared. It can be used for departmental assessment. So my point here is that the grading process, when it is well done and richly done, yields data and artifacts which can be used for departmental and gen ed assessment. Assessment does not have to be totally imposed from the outside. You don't have to use anybody else's test or anybody else's criteria. You just use your own and you make them explicit. In this scheme, then, the assessor is not somebody who comes in and says, these people aren't doing assessment, they have to start doing assessment, and let's figure out what test out there we can use. The assessor, instead, is, in a sense, the student of what teachers are doing, the ethnographer, if you will, who comes in and says, isn't this department interesting? Look at this class. Look at what this teacher or these teachers are expecting from their students. How can we make this articulate? How can we make it more public? How can we build on it? How can we use it for departmental assessment? You use the artifacts of the grading process for departmental assessment. That's my scheme. You use the artifacts of the classroom grading process for departmental assessment. Now let's suppose that this wonderful capstone course is going on. Actually, I want to leave these up, and I want to work on the overhead now. Let's say that this capstone course is working nicely, and the teacher has done this set of criteria and standards, and she's popping along, improving her act every year and getting these students to design good experiments and so on. And now let's say that somebody tells this department that they need an assessment plan. Okay, and after the requisite grumbling, they become convinced they really have to do this. And so let's hypothesize that they get together and they take the first step of an assessment plan, which many of you have already taken, or all of you perhaps have already taken. And that is to decide what outcomes you want to measure, right? What do we want our outcomes to be? Or what do we want our students to be able to do when they get out of here? So step one, then, of this plan is to decide what you want. Step one is not to choose data collection methods. That's why I hate the term portfolio assessment, because it seems to convey that the portfolio is the object of attention. No, no, no. The portfolio is the data. It is what you want to assess that is the object of attention. So this department gets together, and let's hypothesize that they say, we want our majors to be able to, 1, describe basic biological facts, concepts, theories, procedures, whatever. Right? Then, second, we want them to be able to use the scientific method for their own original research. 3, we want them to be able to communicate the results of their research to the scientific community, both orally and in writing. 4, we want them to respect life. Now let's just hypothesize, if you'll give me this, that this biology department has met over a period of a year, and that they have actually been able to agree that this is what they would like their majors to be able to do. How many of your departments are that far along? You have a list of what the outcomes that you want your majors to exhibit, learning that you want from your majors. Okay, most of you are raising your hands. Folks, this is a fairly simple, straightforward process that you're being asked to follow, and the most common mistake is not to keep it simple, is to complex it more than it needs to be complexed. So the first, where do we have simple and effective? Yeah. Simple and effective, folks, means focusing on what you're really being asked to do here and what you're not being asked to do. Don't make it more complex than it has to be. You don't have the resources or the time to complex it up here. Start small, keep it simple. You are being asked by the NCA for a rather simple model of assessment that has several steps. Number one, you decide what kind of learning you want from your students. Number two, you figure out how to measure whether they are learning these things. Number three, you analyze that data. Number four, you use the data to feed back into program and curricular and teaching change. 4 simple steps. What do I want? How do I measure it? How do I analyze the data? And how do I feed it back? Am I leaving out anything? Okay, 4 simple steps. Keep it simple.
I'm not trying to throw a roadblock to this, but we have outside agencies that we deal with our own professional organizations. We have 19 beginning teacher standards. Now, how does that fit into the Keep It Simple model? That's where we have 19 goals that we have to reach for entry-level teachers. And I don't know how that fits into this.
My guess would be, without looking at them or knowing more about your situation, is that simple for you is, hey, we already did this. Use the same list. Yeah. Now, the question is, I've seen some of these lists that departments do for accreditation, and sometimes they are program goals, not student outcomes. The NCA wants you to have a list that focuses on student outcomes. We want our students to blah, blah, blah. Now, I've seen other lists for other accrediting agencies that start out something like, this program will. That's not going to be what you need here. It's a student outcomes. Okay? What's happening to us, friends, is that a relatively simple and in some ways alien model of assessment is being imposed on us. It is an industrial model. It says, what kind of car do you want to produce? How are you going to test whether that car meets your standards? And how are you going to feed back that information into improving your production line? What we've got to do with this is to take it and make it serve our purposes. It's in some senses an alien model, especially to philosophers, less so, I would say, to those of you who are preparing students directly for occupational things, like dental hygiene or physical therapy. I believe, I don't want to speak for them, but I believe that this model is less alien to those people's needs than it is to an English literature person's needs. I'm not preparing students directly to do English literature except as citizens. It's more fuzzy than that. So this model is quite alien to the way in which English departments and philosophy departments and history departments and social departments have operated. But it is the model, and we need to take it and make it ours and make it serve our needs. Let's go back to the biology department then. This is what they want their majors to do. That's step 1. Now they have to figure out how to measure each of these things that they want. That's step 2. How am I going to measure it? Okay? I'm going to divide you into small groups now and ask each of you to take one of these things and brainstorm ways to measure it. Okay? Just form together in groups of 2 or 3. But those little groups that form in this quadrant of the room, do number 1. I gave you the easy job. This quadrant of the room, do number 2. How are we going to measure number 2? Back quadrant of the room, all the little groups that form, you'll do number 3. And the far back quadrant of the room by the windows, you'll do number 4. Gave you the hard one. Do it now. Brainstorm. What are ways? That means what data and what kind of analysis of the data. What data, what modes of analysis will give us some information about whether our students are learning to do these things. I'm going to give you about 5 minutes. What did you suggest? This quadrant of the room. What came up?
Oh, sure. You could have a videotape, you could have an audio tape, you could have them write essays about these, or you could have a little circle of faculty listen to each student and check off if the student could do these things.
Okay. Did everybody hear? Oh, okay. One more time, and let's make a list. This is number 1. Describe basic stuff. Okay? Number 1, describe basic stuff. All right?
Okay, once again, videotape the student doing it, audio tape the student doing it, probably more effective. Have the student write some stuff down on paper which you keep on file. Or have some kind of an exit interview where faculty listen to students do this thing and all certify that student can do that thing at that point in time.
Great. Other ideas?
We just backed up into we first want to find out what counts for basic stuff. Because
Okay.
any field it's going to be a lot.
You need to define what the basic stuff is. Naturally, you will disagree about this. All right. The discussion will be good for you as a department, but it will not be easy. Presumably, however, at some point, you will come to some way of assessing this. The most obvious, to me, what's the most obvious hasn't yet been named, and the one that this department actually did choose. There is a national standardized test called the National Test of Biological Information or something like that. Okay? So a standardized test, in this case, might be the most simple, straightforward, and efficient. What this department decided actually to do was to administer to their seniors in a course or outside of a course, I mean you can do it either way, the national test of biological information, and to keep an ongoing record of the scores that their students achieved on those tests, and to try to improve the scores by feeding back that information and making changes in the curriculum. Okay? You purchase the test, you give it to your students in, you know, the capstone course or the whatever course, or you give it to them on a separate day, you send the results in, you get the little computer printout back, you bring it to the department, you say, are we satisfied with this? What are our strengths? What are our weaknesses? Other additions?
Having done that,
Yes.
and learned some things from it, and perhaps even wanting to do it again, there's a $700 price tag.
Yes.
Getting the money out of the dean to do
That's right.
that kind of thing is pretty interesting.
Okay, there's a $700 price tag to give this assessment to your majors every year. That's an institutional decision. Does the institution want to pay to do this or not? If they do not, then you have to figure out some other way, I guess.
I found the information fairly useless. I mean, so if our students are below the 50th percentile in developmental psychology, that's the only information we got. We don't know what area of developmental psychology. We don't know what specifics. You know, they don't give you feedback at the level that's really useful in terms of something like change. And I think it is useful to every now and then in terms of national standards, but not in terms of interdepartmental standards.
The diagnostic information they gave was really very weak, I guess.
Yes.
Not very useful.
Yes, and NCA will point this out to you. They don't really like you to use standardized tests unless you get diagnostic information. And the experience of this department here indicates that that's a fairly wise and true distinction. That if all you get is the pass rate, then how do you know what to change? You know, so what you might want to do is to do your own exam at least once or twice so that you can get diagnostic information. Where are we weak? Where are we strong? And then you know what to change. There are two sources of information then about the outcomes of standardized tests. One is the company that administers the standardized test and sends you the regular institutional printout, which may or may not have diagnostic information on it. If it doesn't, you may even want to pressure that organization to make that kind of information available. But the other is from the student, who gets fuller information about his or her, maybe gets fuller information about his or her performance. And there may be a way to collect that information from at least a sample of your students.
Without belittling that information, you are having a sampling problem. However, if your goal is for
Yes.
all of your students, who's
right.
taking the LSAT, who's taking the GRE?
You have a sampling problem. That's right. Who takes the LSAT? Who takes the GRE? So another thing you might want to do, friends, is to look at the tests and exams that are already being given in your courses. It's perfectly possible that a number of your faculty members are giving multiple choice exams that test basic procedures, facts, and theories and concepts in your discipline. A lot of our testing in higher education is of this nature, right? Well, is there anything wrong in making the teacher in the 397 course responsible for feeding back the information about how well students do on this exam?
In the case of your example, I would argue yes. That does not, in my opinion, represent description. It represents choosing the correct answer out of four.
The comment is that multiple choice test doesn't represent description. It represents choosing the correct answer out of 4. So here's the question of the validity of multiple choice. I think multiple choice exams have a role in any doable assessment plan. Okay. I'm not going to let a methodological discussion about multiple choice questions get started here. What I'm saying is that in your department, you need to agree what is doable, what will give you some workable information. You might, in fact, go back. This department might have to go back and reframe what it is able to measure. Or in reporting its data, it might have to say, we couldn't really measure whether students could describe basic information in biology. What we were able to measure was whether they could identify an appropriate choice on a multiple choice exam containing this information or testing this information. So, you know, you qualify, you do what you can. That's all you're ever doing, friends. In an educational setting, this is not cornrow science. You cannot control all the variables. And so you're trying to get some information that is useful as a basis for action, for trying to do this better. That's what you're really doing. And you're writing this up for the NCA. They don't expect cornrow science. They know they can't get cornrow science here. Okay, let's go on to number 2. Yeah.
Well, and this kind of gets at the other 3 things up there
Okay.
too, but one of the things that we talked about is instead of going at this one by one, why not have instructors, for example, in courses who are actually teaching upper level students, identifiable sets of students, say in my 400 level class I have 15 of our majors in that class. Why not have that instructor simply write an evaluation towards the end of the semester based on the results of the work, overall work that the student has done?
Yes.
That addresses each of those 4
Sure.
goals and say, how well have these 8 students worked?
That's right.
Satisfying
That's right.
goals as appropriate in my course?
All of these goals could be tested within the context of a capstone course. You could simply make the capstone course responsible for assessing whether students can do this. Now, within that capstone course, therefore, you might give a fact exam or ask students to describe basic concepts, whatever. You might use some of these methods that these folks so nicely suggested. Videotape, audio tape, writing, exit interview, standardized test. It might be that in that capstone seminar, which might have a reasonable number of students in it, the individual teacher, without much change in what they're doing. I mean, because if they're not doing this, if folks in a capstone seminar in biology aren't doing this, what are they doing? You know, I'm guessing that they're already doing a lot of this. And that what you need to do then is to articulate it and focus it, and then feed it back. Feedback, feedback, feedback. The information has got to make its way to the department so that decisions can be made on the basis of it. Let's take the second one. How would you test whether the students know how to use the scientific method for original research? Who had something on that? Which quadrant of the room? Did I give this quadrant? Let me hear what you said. This quadrant. Okay. What'd you say?
Well, again, first have to clearly define as a department what you mean by scientific method and what you mean by original, given the fact that you're undergrad, they don't have a PhD, and then you start from there once you clearly define that. You have to show that there were periods along the way that they were given that information and learned it. There may be some beginning level courses where you taught what the scientific method was, and they showed you that they got that information, and then there might be some guided research in labs or so forth to show you they can implement the lab technique. Then there has to be where you use cast on some end product, whatever the senior thesis or what, where they actually go out and put that all together and come out with a product. But then you have to somehow have that evaluated. Does it have to be published? Does it have to be accepted as a present? Some place where other people are saying this is good enough to be considered quality research at the level that you work with. So you kind of, there's some tests to show that they've learned the information. There's some lab things that show that they've implemented technique. And then there has to be some final product where they have to put it all together.
Yes.
Write it, design it, and do it, and write it.
That's right. All of those things have to be in place. But I think for the assessment, you might be able to make it more simple. Because leading up to teaching the component skills is a curricular matter for the department to discuss. It seems to me that for a start, as an assessment, you might be able to take this capstone course we looked at, in which the teacher is already asking students to conduct a scientific experiment. Now, what you're doing is you're leaving part of that description up to that teacher or those teachers who are teaching the capstone course. And it might be okay to just do that. I do not want to homogenize higher education. It's okay with me if we have some different standards for appropriate scientific report format or for the scientific method here. But what I'm interested in is that these teachers in the senior seminar are each asking their students to conduct original scientific experiment as that teacher defines it. They're a professional. They differ a little from one another, but hey, we're just going to let that sit. We're not going to spend a year in the department wrangling, trying to come to a single definition of the scientific method. That, it seems to me, is a hopeless procedure. That's what makes our field so interesting, is that we do differ. Why should we try to impose on the academy a unanimity that doesn't exist in the field and that isn't good for us either? It seems to me that what you might say in your assessment plan is that in every senior capstone course, the department has agreed that students will be asked to conduct an original scientific experiment, to write it up, and now I'm going to number 3 because I would combine these, to write it up in scientific report format and also to report it orally to their classmates or some other scientific audience, and that this will be evaluated by the teacher on a set of expressly stated criteria. And that the teachers of the senior capstone once a year will make a report to the department about the strengths and weaknesses that are showing up among their students. So that in essence, you take what I already described Ginny is doing. She's coming back to the department and saying, look, guys and gals, these students don't know how to graph. It's driving me buggy. What can we do about this? And so they decide what to do. That's a wonderful feedback loop. That's the teacher using her own criteria and standards coming back and feeding that information back to the department. See, I like to finesse the uniformity question whenever I can by letting individual differences in classrooms be a black box if you possibly can.
You refer to capstone courses, which are not known to us. To make the assessment work, do all of the majors have to go through the capstone, or can you take a random sample of your students?
Right. Some of you don't have a capstone structure to your curriculum, right?
Well, we do, but we suddenly have almost 1,000 majors.
Yeah. Right. Well, then you have to, if you can't do it for all of your students, then you have to use a sampling technique. If you have 1,000 students, a sampling technique makes perfect sense. In an endeavor like this, what you have to pay attention to is how representative is the sample. Yeah. So let's say that this department has this wonderful teacher in it who is already, and in fact this is what happened. This teacher already had this wonderful project which had been shaped in discussion with the department. When they instituted the capstone course, they naturally talked to each other about what it should do. Duh. And on page 27, as we've been looking at, these are the criteria that she established for this original scientific research project in her class. Now, maybe there are 2 other teachers teaching, or maybe there are 16 other teachers teaching this capstone course. But why don't you just ask each of them to establish their criteria? If they talk to each other in this process, you will get some normalization just through conversation. But you don't necessarily want all of them to apply exactly the same criteria, because then you close down a certain wonderful diversity and freedom in your presentation to your students of what the scientific community is really like. It's full of strife is what it's really like, and you know, that's good. So what you want is for the criteria and standards to be explicitly stated. And then you want to say to yourselves and to the NCA, what we've done is to agree that in every capstone course, students will be asked to conduct an original scientific experiment and to report it in writing and orally to a scientific community or to their peers serving as the scientific community. And that the criteria and standards on which this is judged will be made clear by the teacher. And that these will be brought back to the department for discussion and programmatic change. You see, then I think you finesse the issue of all having to agree on the same exact standards or all having to agree on exactly what the scientific format has to be or the scientific method is. Now, what you don't want to say to the NCA is, well, we use grades in the senior seminar to assess these too. This criterion sheet on page 27 is used as the basis for the students' grades. But what you want to say to the NCA, don't use the G word. Instead, explain to them what this is based on. You need to say to them, in the senior capstone course, students are asked, in every section, students are asked to conduct an original scientific experiment and to report it to the scientific community, and the criteria by which that project is judged are made public for departmental discussion and review. And then the information on how well the students are doing, where their strengths and weaknesses lie, is brought back to the department for discussion and curricular change. And then you'll want to give an example of a real change that actually happened because of this. Once you get a history of it, once you get going, they will want to know that you didn't just discuss it. You took appropriate action. Okay? Questions, comments on that? What I'm saying, folks, here is keep it simple and rely on classroom work whenever you can. Now, how about respect life? I want to know what these folks did. How are you going to measure whether your graduates respect life? What'd you come up with?
Well, we had a hard time with this.
No kidding. They had a hard time. How do you measure respect? Good. Other ideas? Oh, you had a great one. You suggested that we look at criminal records for murder, child abuse, mayhem.
I wasn't in that group, but I think having the student in the room with a small baby bunny and whether they stomp on it or not.
Okay. Oops.
Bunny stomping.
The bunny stomping. It's been a long day, folks. This workshop is going downhill fast. But you know, there's an actual principle here, and that is that if you are a biology department which takes your seniors out on field trips and gives them internships, won't your own experience as faculty members be a possible source of data? I should think that you could ask teachers to report on certain aspects of what shows up. I mean, at the University of Cincinnati, we used to send majors from several departments over to the zoo. We had a working relationship with the zoo. And they did volunteer internships there under the collaborative mentorship of somebody on campus and somebody at the zoo. Well, it seems to me that those people who are working with those students are both teaching and getting some sense of respect for life attitudes here, and that since they have that information now, it might be possible to gather that in some way, to ask them to come back and report. Why don't you just ask the teachers who are doing that zoo internship to come in and talk about how they perceive the attitudes and behaviors of the students with whom they work, and let the department talk about that. I mean, it's not precise, it's not cornrow science, it's secondhand in a way because it's a report by an observer, but it's better than nothing, and I'll bet this department has never had a discussion together about how they enhance their students' respect for life. I bet they never have. I bet this would be a first in history. I bet they'd all go home saying, gee, we should talk about this more often. This is what we really care about. How come we never talked about it? So it seems to me that you could say to the NCA that those teachers who supervise or mentor students in internships, field experiences, or other settings where they can draw some conclusions about students' attitudes and behaviors, that these folks report to the department annually in a conversation, and that the department tries to figure out how they can enhance students' appreciation for life, or respect for life. Now, the actual department also decided to collect some reports of students' extracurricular activities. And so they do survey their seniors to ask them what kinds of activities they have, extracurricular activities they have participated in. So the students will put down, you know, I worked for the zoo, or I, you know, marched for polio, or there's no polio anymore, but I marched for muscular dystrophy, or, you know, whatever it is that's relevant here. And again, it's not cornrow science, but you're getting some information that you never had before. And the conversation around this information may lead you to make some changes in your curriculum. Questions, comments? Mm-hmm. Students' assessment of themselves, can you use that? That is considered an indirect measure of learning. However, there is literature which establishes that there is a significant positive correlation between what students say they have learned and what they actually seem to have learned according to an outside test that they take. And there's a body of literature. People have done this. And so I think that you could establish that students do have some sense of what they learn, and that to ask them what they learned or ask them specifics about their learning experience would be a useful kind of data, although NCA would classify it as indirect. Don't forget, multiple measures are what they want here. They don't believe that you can measure student learning by any single measure, and they are, of course, correct about that. Students' evaluation of one another. Trickier than self-evaluation, but perhaps also in certain settings a useful tool. I don't know, I'd have to know more about the specific instance.
Two or three possibilities. One might be in a course where there were some student presentations and you asked students
Yes.
to give you some feedback on the quality of the
Okay.
presentation.
How about a course?
Some criteria.
Yes. How about a course in which students assessed one another's presentations? In fact, Ginny in her science class does that. She asks the students ahead of time what criteria they would use to evaluate one of their own peers' oral presentation on the results of his or her scientific experiment. And of course, this is something that students know pretty well, actually, what makes a good oral presentation, don't they? Because they listen to them all the time, poor souls. So what do you think they say? I mean, if you asked a biology class of seniors, what would you like to see when your peers get up here and make a presentation to you? What are they going to say? What are they going to say? Sure, they may say, I want to be entertained. They may say, I want them to keep my interest. A little humor wouldn't hurt. Wake me up. What else? Well organized, clear, good overheads and visuals.
Biology or another science that the evidence does indeed lead to the conclusion.
Sure. Sure, the evidence leads to conclusion. So what Ginny does is to make an overhead list of all of these things as her class generates them, and then turns that into a criterion sheet that they actually use for peers to evaluate one another's oral presentations. She adds her own evaluation, and the combination of the two is the grade. Fine. In fact, I think that's a wonderful way to do it. Because if the purpose of the speaker is to make the results of the scientific experimentation clear and understandable, and also perhaps entertaining, interest-catching to a particular audience, then the judgment of the audience, it seems to me, is perfectly relevant. The question is, I can see using multiple choice tests and classroom experiences and experiments and student responses to one another's peer presentations and so on. I can see using all those, but how do you get them in a common format, is that right? And for presentation to the administration? Well, the answer is, who do you really need to present these artifacts to? Who is the audience of this data collection that you are doing? And the answer is you, yourself, the department. The NCA does not care about whether your students are scoring 0 on your test of using the scientific method. I mean, the NCA doesn't want to know how well your students did on this scientific experimentation. They want to know that you know and that you used the information. And so if the information from the capstone course, let's say there are 12 different teachers teaching the capstone course, and each of them has somewhat different criteria for this scientific experiment. But let's say that the department then asks each of these teachers to use a common format, maybe the primary trait format like here. Let's say the department agrees that each of these teachers will keep their, will write up their criteria in a common format using the primary trait rubric, okay? So you may decide to impose some unanimity on your reporting of the data. But then let's say that these are presented to the department for discussion in all their richness and diversity. I don't see anything wrong with that. The administration may not even need to see these. Why would they need to see it? All they need to see is your assessment plan so they can turn it into NCA. NCA doesn't want to see these. They want to know that you saw them, that you dealt with them, that you fed them back into departmental planning. And that's where I think we have, that's the briar patch, folks. That's the briar patch. See? We're Brer Rabbit in this enterprise, I believe. And we're looking for the briar patch where we get to preserve our own academic values and culture. And I believe that the NCA has left us a briar patch because they have not demanded that we turn the data over to them for external assessment of how well our students are doing. All they ask us to do is to use our own data and then explain to them how we have done that and that we have done that. So I think we get to stay in the briar patch. Now, where we don't get to stay in the briar patch is in states that are distributing resources by performance-based funding. Do you have that here? Okay, fall on your knees and be thankful that performance-based funding has not yet entered your system, because some states are dealing with the fact that the board and the legislature want to know the results of your students' performances on certain kinds of tests of learning, and that you will get more or less money depending on how well your students learn. And that's a much crueler form.
The logic, of course, would be for performing badly, they give you more money to improve.
No, wrong. For performing badly, they give you less money. For performing well, they give you more money. Ohio has started down that road. Some states are farther along. That's a real hardball game. Other questions, comments? Yes. Most departments will have several different, which I say lines, of goals going. This is obviously for majors. However, in some departments, for example, music departments, you typically have performance majors, and you have music history majors, and maybe you have music education majors. And there are other similar departments that have quite distinct tracks. English departments tend to have writing majors and literature majors. So you may need a separate set of outcomes for each of those majors, and a separate set of outcomes for your non-majors. You just handle it like a different program within your major. And then you talk about how the courses that those non-majors take are meeting those goals. Most universities have started assessment by asking folks to assess the major, and then they have turned over gen ed assessment to a separate interdisciplinary committee. Is that how you've done it? Yeah. Those interdisciplinary gen ed committees, they have a somewhat harder time, but the process is the same. They basically have to decide what they want a student to be able to do at the end of the gen ed program, and then they have to figure out ways to manage that. And what several schools are doing, including one that I'm working with very intensively, this is one of the colleges, one of the branch campuses of the University of Cincinnati, they're using this same scheme. One of the things they want is critical thinking from their gen ed students. And they are asking all those who teach in gen ed to hand in a list of criteria that they use to evaluate students' work in critical thinking in primary trait format. And they will assess that information, analyze that information, and feed it back into curricular change. So again, they are allowing the different definitions of critical thinking to be left alone. This college wisely did not spend a year, actually it might be 2 years, trying to come up with a single definition of critical thinking that was specific enough to base any test on. Talk about a futile, and futile arrangement, boy. That's it. So they just simply finessed that question. And they said critical thinking is being assessed in these classes according to these criteria that are established by the instructor. These criteria are shared so that there is cross-fertilization, but the instructors then turn in what they are using. That stuff is analyzed, and a report is made back to the faculty for changes in the gen ed curriculum. Okay, folks, I think that what you might do next is to get together in your department groups and talk about what this means for you. Feel free to do that someplace else besides this room if this physical setting is a little unhappy for you. Feel free to come and get me. I will be up here as the consultant. You can come and get me if you need me or want me in your group, or if you have a particular question, just come up and ask you. But I think it's time for us to think in the last 20 minutes, how are you going to apply this to your own situation? Sound okay? Is that a good thing to do now?
I have one point of information.
Mm-hmm.
Everything we talked about here is kind of summative.
Mm-hmm.
Capstone. Does the NCA
Yes.
require an informative type thing to try to find problems early before students graduate, or is our only responsibility to do summative type of stuff?
It seems to me that it is an inescapable responsibility of the department, once it knows that these are the 4 things it wants out of its majors, to develop and teach these things throughout its curriculum. The NCA wants to know that your outcomes from this measurement are being fed back in. A lot of those actions that you take will be to say, well, how come we're not working on the scientific method earlier on? I mean, why do we spring this on them as seniors?
What I'm getting at is summative to tell you where the problems are, for the next group to fix it.
That's right.
But for that group that went through, they're walking away with a deficit. I'm not saying we have to do formative. I'm just asking, do they expect you to do some of that so that they don't get to seniors and have these major deficits?
Right. What they want to know is that you know where your seniors stand and what their deficits are, and that you're acting on that information. Now, you do get into something else, which is a kind of where were they as sophomores beginning, and where did you take them? That's kind of the second stage, but I don't want to get into that here, because I don't think that most of you are ready. Yeah. How do we measure what our majors can do? Let's start there. Okay? All right, in your groups then, you're welcome to keep this conversation going as long as it's useful to you. You can leave when it's no longer useful. Bill, you want a last word? Okay? And call on me if you need me. Okay?